There's a song by a modern rock band called Guster, and their song is called Amsterdam. It's one of my family's favorites, and in the chorus, the songwriter says this: I'm going to write you a letter, I'm going to write you a book. I want to see your reaction. I want to see how it looks. He's writing a song to his ex who has broken his heart, and he wants to air his grievances. And there are a lot. There's enough grievances to fill a book. And he wants to let her know the countless ways that she has wronged him. He wants to list all these injustices, and he wants to take pleasure in watching her feel that same hurt that he felt. That he wants to be vindicated. And maybe you've been there. Maybe someone has wronged you, and you want to let them know how much you've hurt them. So you want to write out a letter telling them all the things that they've done wrong. And maybe you haven't had enough sense, but you sent the letter anyway, and you regretted it. Several years ago, I received this Facebook message from, I thought it was my dad, ended up being his wife, Kathy, and she sent me this kind of little note that said, I can't believe you didn't wish your father a happy Veterans Day. Now, to be clear, I don't really wish anybody happy Veterans Day on Facebook. I don't wish people a happy birthday because, you get caught up in all that chaos. You miss someone and they're going to get slighted and all that. And I didn't know that was a big deal. But I was annoyed. I was frustrated. And so I ended up writing back, berating him for all the Christmases and birthdays that he failed to acknowledge. The fact that he didn't even mention the birth of my own children. And I hadn't seen him for like 10 or 15 years or something like that, not since right around the time of our wedding. And so he rarely communicated with them, but now the scab had been ripped off and I was going to let him have it. So I wrote a letter. I wrote a book, and I wanted him to feel that pain that I had felt over all the years. Of course, it didn't really resolve anything. A few months later, I get this strange envelope from him filled with some cards and some cash, and Dawn is confused, like, what in the world is going on? And I had to confess to her my sin and how I reacted in anger. And then, as we talked, I realized I had to call my dad and confess to him how I handled myself. It was a difficult situation, and nothing really changed. We really rarely had communication after that either. But that was crazy. But writing letters aren't always a bad thing. There are times where we want to share our experiences with the people we love. When Dawn and I were first dating, we were both living in separate countries. I was living in Hungary, she was living in the Czech Republic, and we were dating long distance for that year. And while living cross-culturally, we were sending each other letters. In the letters, we were sharing our experiences, our longing to be with each other, and oftentimes for me, my doubts that were creeping in because of the time we spent apart. But letters formed the backbone of our early relationship. And now in our days of email and text and instant global communication, the art of letter writing has changed. But I'm sure it changed at the dawning of the printing press, or the Pony Express, or the typewriter, or the word processor. Still, letters are powerful and an important way to convey a message. It could be a message of love, of anger, of frustration, of encouragement. And I'm sure most of us, when we head to our mailboxes, we hope that it won't just be filled with bills and ads, but there might be a personal message from someone that we love. The Apostle Paul, he was known for sending letters. He would send letters to instruct, to encourage, to rebuke, and to convict. And he wrote letters to churches and individuals. In fact, we have about 12 letters written by him to different people at that time. And we've still used these letters 2,000 years later to help us understand what it means to live faithfully as Christians. So I wonder, when Titus knew he was going to receive a letter, was he thinking it was going to be some in-depth theological dissertation about the gospel like Paul wrote to the people of Rome? Or was it going to be a scathing commentary on the church's failings like he wrote to the people of Corinth? Would it be a warning about false doctrine infiltrating the church, like he wrote to the Galatians? Or would it be instructions on living a Christ-centered, faithful life to the people of Ephesus? Or maybe it was going to be a short note, like the one he wrote to Philemon about encouraging him to how to treat a fellow brother in the faith. I can imagine Titus there at the mailbox with this letter in hand, wondering if he should open it at all. Maybe it's just going to be a short little instructions of constructive criticisms or assurance that Titus was on the right path. Over the next 6 weeks, we're going to look at this letter that Paul wrote to Titus. And in this letter, Paul is encouraging Titus to be devoted to good. Titus is commissioned to lead by example. And then he's to choose leaders who live as examples and compel God's people to learn to be examples. He was encouraging to be devoted to good. As we begin our look through this letter, we have to understand who the author is and who he's writing to and why this letter was written. And then we can understand why this letter is important even now, 2,000 years later. And as we look at this letter, and as we would look at any passage of Scripture, we have to remind ourselves that it's written in a different language. It wasn't written in English. It was written at a different time, 2,000 years ago, to a different culture, a different part of the world. And so as we look at it as 21st century Americans, we might be confused or offended by some of the things he might write. We might wonder why the Bible would say something like it says, but we have to hope that we can understand, as we understand the context a little bit, we can have a better understanding of how that affects our lives today. First thing we need to discover is that this letter was written by Paul. And unlike any letter that we probably write now, it didn't start, "Dear Titus." It started with Paul introducing himself and establishing his authority for writing the letter. He writes, "Paul, a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ." Well, we know about Paul that he was originally named Saul, and he was a Pharisee. He rose up in prominence shortly after the resurrection of Jesus, and he was adamantly opposed to this group of Jews who had claimed to be Jesus followers. He saw as his goal to wipe out this cult and restore true belief back to his people. One day, while on a mission to arrest and execute these followers of Jesus, he had a miraculous encounter. On the road to Damascus, Jesus spoke to Paul and called him out of his legalistic lifestyle into a grace-filled, gospel-centered life. And for the rest of his life, Paul would travel around the Middle East and Southern Europe, preaching and teaching about Jesus, planting churches, and during his travels, he met plenty of opposition, but he never wavered in his faith. And while not recorded in the Bible, most people believe that Paul was eventually beheaded because he would not renounce his faith in Jesus. Paul begins his letter by introducing himself and offering his credentials. And this wasn't just done for Titus' sake, because Titus knew Paul, but he knew that this letter was going to be shared with others, and Paul wanted to know that he had the authority to instruct Titus and the other believers. And this authority that he had was given to him by God. He says he's Paul, a servant of God and the apostle of Jesus Christ. He wants those to know that he has this twofold authority, a servant and an apostle. First, Paul calls himself a servant of God. This can also be translated as God's slave. Here, Paul is acknowledging that he is not the official authority, but he is under the lordship of God. That he humbly admits that his life is not his own. He is, as John Stott would say, bought, owned, and directed by God. Next, he calls himself an apostle of Jesus Christ, which was a bold claim in that early Christian tradition. It typically would be the apostle title unto Jesus' original disciples, those who were eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection, those whose teaching would become the foundation of the Christian church. Because of Paul's unique encounter with Jesus and his calling on the Damascus Road, Paul also adopts that title of apostle. So here he is. He is a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus, not for his own benefit or reward, but for the benefit of others. He says, for the faith of God's elect and their knowledge of the truth that leads to godliness. Paul has embraced his role as servant and apostle for the faith and knowledge of God's people, so that the people of God will believe and know the truth. Paul is letting Titus and all those who read the letter know that he has been commissioned by God to help people come to faith, to know the truth, and to believe in Jesus, and then to have a deeper and ever-growing understanding of who Jesus is and what he has done for them, so that he will be allowed to reshape their lives. You see, because knowledge leads to understanding, and understanding leads to action. Knowing the truth moves us to growing in the truth, which moves us to living out the truth. We are to know, grow, and show the love of Christ so that those who follow Jesus will be devoted to good. We live in a world that might say that there are three separate ways of practicing your faith. There are those who believe, those who have knowledge, and those who have action. That those who believe that there's a God, and they've said a prayer, and that's good enough for them. And there are those who seek knowledge, who spend their time studying God's Word, but they don't really put it into practice. And finally, there are those who are out there doing good, but they don't really understand why or the heart of it. But Paul wants his readers to discover that following Jesus doesn't simply choose one of knowledge or understanding or practice, but a true disciple contains all three. Now that Paul has established who he is and his credentials and calling, he turns his attention to his protege, Titus, and he calls him his true son in the common faith. Titus was a Gentile that Paul met on his missionary journeys, and he developed a close and deep personal relationship with him. They were like a father and a son, and Paul would love and mentor and train and support Titus and help guide him to fully into the calling that God had for him. Paul says, he continues this, the reason I left you in Crete was to set right what was left undone, and as I directed you to appoint elders in every town. So Paul had moved to a new place, but he left Titus on this island of Crete, an island in the Mediterranean Sea, and he gave them these specific instructions. Now Titus was on a solo mission in a complicated place, and Paul wants to offer him encouragement. Titus, you are to remain committed in your faith and devoted to doing good. He offers advice and support and encouragement for the task that is set before him. Titus has the task of planting churches throughout that island nation and to make certain that these churches have people leading their congregations with integrity. Because a church, and Paul believed that a church leader is not a leader that's based on a person's skill, but on their character. And the reason Paul will highlight a leader's character is because of the reputation of the people of Crete. The people who lived on that island, they had a notorious reputation. In fact, it was like a badge of honor with this reputation that they had. In a letter, Paul quotes a Cretan philosopher who paints a poor picture of his own people. He says, one of their own, very own prophets said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. Not really a nice way to describe your own people. And you think, It'd be like a person from Augusta claiming that all Mainers are cold, distant, and aloof. What makes matters worse, Paul doesn't disagree with him. Paul, as an outsider and an apostle, actually agrees with this person. He says, this testimony is true. Now, to our 21st century perspective, it might not seem very Christ-like for Paul to agree with a person like that. I mean, is Paul really trying to stereotype these people, saying that all Christians act this way? I don't think that Paul really is saying that every single person in Crete is a liar, an evil beast, or a lazy glutton. But he's saying that there's this prominent culture that's in opposition to the godliness that Titus has been commissioned to serve. The culture of Crete is going to be a sinful, self-seeking atmosphere. And that is why it's absolutely vital that you appoint godly, blameless, self-sacrificing leaders of the church. Leaders of the church are not to live into the reputation of the surrounding culture, but to rise above it. And in the midst of the lazy liars and gluttons, Titus must be an example for all those around him. In the middle of this letter, Paul tells Titus how he is to guide and train the faithful followers, but he makes it abundantly clear that the best way for Titus to lead others in faith is to live by example, to be an example of integrity and dignity. So this is pretty much the center of the letter. He says this to Titus: make yourself an example of good works with integrity and dignity in your teaching. Titus is the person who's dedicated to following Jesus. And the best thing that he can do is work with integrity and teach with dignity. Because your actions and your words must work in tandem in order for you to be an effective witness for Jesus. So Paul is saying, Titus, my true son, you are to be an example of Jesus. You're to be an example of Jesus to the people of Crete. You are to be an example to those who are in the church. You are to be an example to those who are outside the church. And as an example, what you must do what you do with integrity, with truth and honor. And you must teach people with dignity and distinction and respect, because the Cretans are watching. And then Paul continues saying that your message is to be sound, beyond reproach, so that any opponent will be ashamed, because he doesn't have anything bad to say about us. In other words, those who wish to challenge you will look foolish because your character reflects your teaching, and your teaching reflects your character. Titus, you are to live your life surrounded by these Cretans as an example, filled with the good works of integrity and dignity in your teaching. And while Paul is writing to Titus, we, 2,000 years later, as followers of Jesus, are also called to live as examples with integrity and dignity. We must be people who are speaking our words and working our actions as examples of Jesus' love and grace. We are to be examples in our church, examples in our homes, at our jobs, at the grocery store, on our social media accounts, even when we're talking to those customer service representatives. Because I have to admit, that's a hard one for me. Hard one when I'm trying to talk to someone and I'm getting the runaround. Like a few weeks ago, I had to call our bank for some silly, what should have been, I felt like a quick little thing. And so I talked to one person, and they said, I got to transfer you to the appropriate representative. So they transferred me to another person, and I explained the situation, and they said, I have to transfer you to the appropriate representative. And another person, I have to transfer you to the... It was just like chaos, and I was about to lose it. But it was hard to follow Paul's advice to make yourself an example of good works with integrity and dignity. But we need to, because like it or not, people are watching. It's easy, though, to excuse ungodly behavior because we live in a world that's ruled by liars and evil beasts and lazy gluttons. It's easy to copy the behaviors and patterns of the world around us. Our coworkers are going to lie on their expense reports, so why shouldn't we? Everyone on TV is sleeping around with everyone else, and they seem to be happy, so why shouldn't we? It's easy to let the actions of others shape who we are, but it takes integrity and dignity to follow the path of Christ. Paul compels Titus, and he compels all of us, to make ourselves examples of good work with integrity and dignity in our teaching. And then Paul wraps up his letter with this final instruction. He says, let our people learn to devote themselves to good work for the pressing needs, so that they will not be unfruitful. Titus is commissioned to lead by example, to choose leaders who live as examples, and to compel God's people to learn to be examples. To quote Wanda Round from our small group on Wednesday, the goodness is to permeate the church. Everyone who calls themselves a follower of Jesus is called to rise above that self-centered culture that glorifies liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons, and to devote themselves to the goodness of God and the blessings of others. And through our study of Titus, we'll continue to unpack what it means to be devoted to good, and our small groups will dive deeper and wrestle with this text and try to see how it applies to their lives. Today, I just want to leave you with 3 little quick insights on what it means for us as 21st century Christians to be devoted to good. Paul reminds Titus that the way of faith is not an instant change, but it's a learning process. So first, he says, let our people learn to devote themselves to good work. Our natural inclination, like the people of Crete, is probably to be lazy, liars, and gluttons. I know I tend to be that way a lot. But our new nature, for those of us who are in Christ, leads toward good. So while salvation happens in that moment, we surrender our lives to Christ. Sanctification is working in our life. It's God changing us and making us become someone new. It's something we learn and grow in our faith. It's a continual process in our lives. Last week, Dawn talked about the important way for us to learn from God is to listen to the shepherd. The more time we spend with Jesus, the more we'll hear what he has to say for us. And she quoted Jesus in John 10 saying, my sheep listen to my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. Jesus is letting us know what he's calling us to do. We need to spend time and listen to him so that we know how to follow him. And the more we listen, the more we learn to hear our shepherd's voice, the more we can devote ourselves to good. As Jesus' half-brother James would later write, don't just listen to God's word, do what it says. Otherwise, you're fooling yourself. Learning to listen and listening leads to responding. We learn to do good by listening and responding to our shepherd. But doing good is not just about a personal reward system or a legalistic pyramid scheme. We are called not to do good in order to earn God's favor. We're doing good as a response of God's favor. We are not to do good for the acclaim of others, but for the benefit of others. Being devoted to good is not legalistic, it's evangelistic. Those who seek to do good for legalistic reasons are attempting to earn God's blessings and man's adoration. They think that it's what they need to do. They are selfishly motivated, but no amount of good works will ever justify us before God. It's by grace that we've been saved, not by our works. Our works should not be aimed at self-promotion, but as a way of sharing God's loving kindness with others. We should be devoted to doing good so that others can experience the goodness of God. And finally, being devoted to good leads to fruitful lives. We all want to have a life that's meaningful, a life that's filled with purpose. And how often does someone sit at their deathbed and wish their life wasn't fruitful? How many of us wish we would be fine like the Cretans? Man, Dave was such a liar, evil beast, and lazy glutton. We don't want that. We want our lives to have meaning and purpose. In Death of a Salesman, Willie Loman longed for a funeral that would be filled with people offering him praises, that clients and customers and those he sold things to would mourn the loss of a great man and an incredible salesman. We all want our lives to be bigger than ourselves. We want to be fruitful and multiply. But what we should understand is the fruitful lives that Paul is talking about is not the fruits of our labor in terms of wealth or power or position. Paul wants them to have lives that are defined and refined by the fruits of the Spirit. Those who follow Jesus, who are devoted to good, they are to be known by the fruitful blooming of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. As followers of Jesus, each and every one of us are called and compelled and challenged by God to be men and women who are devoted to good. So we listen to the Savior and do what he says. We practice our faith by caring for the good of others so that they can experience the goodness of God. In doing so, doing good for others, we will lead these fruitful lives. Paul has written Titus a letter. And in this letter, he reminds Titus that he is commissioned by God to lead by example, by being devoted to good. And that he is to choose leaders that live by example, who are being devoted to good. And he compels all of God's people to learn to be examples by devoting themselves to doing good. And while this letter is now 2,000 years old, it still carries that same message for us today. That we as followers of Jesus, living in our modern day Crete, should be to devote ourselves to good works for the pressing needs, so that we will not be unfruitful. Amen.